Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the wildest edges of Alaska, where silence has a weight, where the air bites your lungs, and where one man spent over 40 years living almost entirely alone. You're stepping into the world of Frank Glazer, the so-called Wolf Man of Alaska. Imagine being dropped into a frozen wilderness so vast that even the mountains look lonely. The snow crunches under your boots like cracking glass, and the air smells sharp enough to sting your nose. You can see your breath hang like ghosts in front of you. You probably won't survive this, but somehow, he did. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins in the early 1910s, when you step off a creaking mail boat at the tiny port of Valdez. The air hits you like a wall of knives. It's early winter, the sun is already slouching toward the horizon by mid-afternoon, and the men unloading crates mutter about a greenhorn trapper heading inland. That would be Frank Glazer, 20-something, fresh from the lower 48 with more stubbornness than sense. His coat is second-hand, his rifle looks too small for bear country. And yet there's something in his eyes, some glint of quiet calculation, that suggests he knows what he's getting into. You trail behind him as he hauls his sled inland toward the Tanana River basin, where the map dissolves into blank white. Historians still argue whether Glazer came chasing adventure or running from something. Some say he was dodging the law, others claim he just couldn't stand fences anymore. Either way, Alaska welcomed him the same way it greets everyone, with indifference and ice. He pitched his first camp near a frozen stream, where wind whistled through spruce trees like a haunted flute. Nights stretched so long you start to forget what day feels like. You can hear the distant howls of wolves echoing through the valleys. For most people, that sound means fear. For Glazer, it became a kind of lullaby. He didn't come here to conquer nature, he came to understand it, though he probably wouldn't have put it that way. He was just trying to make it through another night without freezing his boots solid. By day, you watch him learn the rhythm of survival, cutting firewood before dawn, melting snow for water, stretching what little flour he had into a kind of gluey bannock bread that tasted vaguely like regret. He was already being molded by the land, his hands cracked and blistered, his beard frozen with breath, and his sense of time dissolving into the endless white. The town men back in Valdez laughed at him. They said he'd be back by spring, starved or frostbitten or worse. But spring came and went, and word trickled down the trail that the greenhorn was still alive, thinner, quieter, and a little wild-eyed, but alive. There's a quirky little story from those early months. Glazer once tried to boil coffee at -40 and discovered it froze before it could percolate. So, he drank it half slushy, claiming it kept him alert. You imagine that scene, him sitting by a sputtering fire, sipping icy coffee, grinning to himself as wolves called somewhere beyond the timberline. You start to feel what he must have felt, the way the silence presses against your chest, how the stars look almost too close, how the crack of a tree branch can sound like gunfire in the night. It's both terrifying and weirdly soothing, like being swallowed by the planet itself. By the second winter, Glazer was already shedding the city from his bones. He moved further inland, toward the Tanana River, where he'd later trap wolves, foxes, and lynx for the U.S. Biological Survey. That's when people began calling him the Wolf Man, not because he hunted them, but because he seemed to think like them. But that part's still ahead. For now, it's just you and him and the snow, two stubborn creatures trying to outlast the cold. At night, as the aurora ripples green and violet above, Glazer lies awake inside his crude tent, listening. He can tell the difference between the cry of a lone wolf and the chorus of a hunting pack. He doesn't fear them, he's fascinated. He sketches paw prints in his notebook by lamplight, noting stride length and pattern. Later, those notes will become some of the earliest informal studies of Alaskan wolf behavior, though nobody will know that for decades. There's something deeply hypnotic about this first chapter of his life. No radio. No roads. No backup plan. Just the hum of wind through spruce branches and the occasional spark of snow catching moonlight. You can almost taste the air, dry, metallic, untouched. Every breath feels borrowed. One night, as you watch the fire burn low, you realize the wilderness isn't something Glazer is surviving, it's something he's slowly merging with. His hands move like part of the landscape, even his heartbeat seems to sync with the slow rhythm of the river ice shifting nearby. You begin to understand how 40 years alone might not be madness at all, but a strange kind of clarity, and as the first wolf howls again, closer this time, you see him lift his head, listening. The corners of his mouth twitch, not in fear, but in recognition. Somewhere out there, another predator is testing the night. You and the wolf man both smile, because somehow, against all logic, this frozen nowhere has started to feel like home. You wake to the sound of snow falling, the kind that barely whispers when it lands, a hush so deep it feels like the sky is holding its breath. The morning light is thin, almost reluctant, filtering through clouds that never seem to leave. You pull on frozen boots, fingers stiff, breath curling in pale ribbons. Out here, every step is a choice between freezing and learning. And Frank Glazer, your quiet teacher in this endless white classroom, learned fast. The first thing he ever learned to read was the snow. Each track told a story, if you knew how to listen. The wide pad of a lynx, the tidy print of a fox, and then, those unmistakable ones, the elongated, purposeful stride of a wolf. You kneel beside one, pressing your gloved hand against the imprint. It's larger than your palm, and the edges are sharp where the cold bit them overnight. The trail weaves between stands of spruce and vanishes into the pale distance. This was Glazer's world, his textbooks written in paw prints and his lessons whispered by wind. He followed those trails day after day, sometimes for miles, until the outlines of the wolves' world began to reveal themselves. Historians still argue whether Glazer was sent by the government to study predator control or if he started tracking wolves purely out of personal fascination. Either way, by the 1920s, he was Alaska's most reliable authority on the species, though authority feels like a word too civilized for a man who slept beside campfires with a rifle across his knees. The mainstream historical fact is this: Frank Glazer became one of the earliest field observers for the U.S. Biological Survey, working on predator-prey research before the term wildlife biologist even existed. But the quirky tidbit, one of those side stories that historians smirk at, is how he reportedly trained himself to imitate wolf calls. He'd stand on the ridge at dusk and let out a long, rising howl. Sometimes, a pack would answer. Sometimes, they wouldn't. But when they did, he swore he could tell what mood they were in, playful, defensive, or curious. You try to imagine that scene, Glazer silhouetted against a violet sky, his breath steaming like smoke as he calls into the wind. Then, from the tree lean, a chorus answers. Low, layered, haunting. It's not a sound you hear so much as feel in your ribs. And in that echoing moment, the line between man and beast blurs. There's a story he told years later, that once, while following a trail near the Kantishna Hills, he came across the remains of a caribou freshly killed. The snow around it was disturbed, paw prints everywhere, and above them, one human track, his own. He realized he'd been shadowing the pack for hours without knowing they'd looped back behind him. He turned slowly and saw yellow eyes watching from the trees. Not one pair, several. He didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he just stood there, heart thudding, and said softly into the cold, "Well, I suppose you were here first." They stared a moment longer, then melted back into the forest. He took the hint. It's hard to tell how much of that story is truth and how much is wilderness myth. But out here, the difference doesn't matter. The isolation plays tricks on your sense of scale, makes legends feel ordinary and ordinary moments feel sacred. Glazer wasn't alone in his fascination. Early Alaskan settlers and trappers saw wolves mostly as pests, blamed for lost dogs and dwindling game. But Glazer's notes hinted at something more nuanced. He wrote about wolf hierarchy, mating habits, and the way they seemed to coordinate hunts with eerie precision. He wasn't sentimental, he still trapped and shot them when necessary, but he respected them. "They're smart as sin," he once said, "and twice as stubborn." By now, you've learned that stubbornness is Alaska's first rule of survival. Glazer's second rule: observe everything. Even boredom became a form of data. He noted how the wolves traveled in family units, how they'd cache meat in snowbanks, and how they sometimes played, rolling and nipping like overgrown dogs. To him, those were not monsters. They were neighbors trying to get through the same brutal winter. Still, life out here wasn't all mystic harmony and wolf poetry. You're reminded of that one night when a blizzard came howling through, no pun intended, and buried his camp. He woke under 2 feet of snow, his tent collapsed, his rifle missing. He dug out, shivering, laughing quietly to himself. Later, when he finally found the rifle barrel poking from the drift, he carved "woke up snowed in, still alive" into a birch trunk. A record. Of sorts. By the late 1920s, the wolf man's reputation had grown. Pilots flying supply routes claimed they could sometimes spot him from above, just a tiny figure moving steadily across the tundra, dogs in tow, leaving trails that looked like calligraphy across the snow. A few thought he was some kind of hermit monk, others said he was a ghost story made flesh, and maybe, in a sense, he was. You think about how strange it is, to be a ghost among the living. He wasn't cut off from civilization by accident, he'd chosen this exile. It wasn't punishment, it was preference. There's a moment late one evening when you catch yourself mimicking his movements. You follow a set of prints. Crouch to examine them, listen to the distant bark of ravens. For a fleeting instant, you understand what kept him here, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you can read the earth itself. Historians still debate whether Glazer was driven more by curiosity or solitude. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that he endured, through blizzards, hunger, and the long silence that would have broken most men. As the day fades, you watch him return to camp, his face windburned, his beard tipped with frost. He pours coffee that steams in the blue dusk, scribbles notes by firelight, and hums something tuneless. Outside, wolves answer one another in distant harmony. And you realize that this isn't the story of a man surviving the wild. It's the story of a man learning its language, one paw print at a time. By your third winter in the Alaskan backcountry, you finally stop expecting warmth. The human body, you learn, adjusts to deprivation just as easily as it adjusts to comfort, perhaps more so. Frank Glazer had long since crossed that line. His little cabin, if you can call a half-buried rectangle of driftwood and salvaged planks a cabin, was both fortress and coffin. You duck inside and feel the sting of smoke in your eyes. The fire gives just enough light to turn the frost on the ceiling into glittering stalactites. He built it himself, mostly by trial and error, somewhere near the mouth of the Melazitna River. The nearest human settlement is a week's travel by dog sled. You can hear the logs pop and sigh as the frozen sap inside them bursts from the heat. There's a tin coffee pot on the coals, blackened to near invisibility. He's got a couple of caribou hides strung along one wall, a rifle above the door, and a stack of yellowed notebooks by the cot. You sit beside him as he pours the coffee. It's the color of tar and the consistency of sorrow. He laughs when it freezes around the rim of the cup before he can drink it. Makes it crunchy, he says. Humor, dry, quiet, and sometimes borderline absurd, is what keeps him sane out here. That, and the company of his dogs, whose breath fogs the air like tiny steam engines. Historians still argue whether Glazer truly preferred this isolation or if he'd simply forgotten how to return to people. He'd been offered posts in town, even chances to work as a government hunter closer to Fairbanks, but he kept drifting back into the bush. The truth, as you're starting to sense, is that civilization made him restless. Cities hummed too loudly. He couldn't sleep unless the silence was absolute. The mainstream fact is that during these years, Glazer kept meticulous logs for the U.S. Biological Survey, details about wolf predation, caribou migrations, and weather extremes. But the fringe tidbit? He occasionally wrote letters to himself. Full conversations. You flip one open, the ink faint from dampness. If it keeps snowing, I'll have to eat the radio biscuits again. Note to self, never buy government rations packed by someone who's never been cold. You can't help but smile. Even alone, he found ways to talk. Outside, the temperature drops to 40 below. The sound it makes is indescribable, like the air itself tightening. You step outside with him to split wood. Each swing of the axe sends a jolt up your arms. The logs split clean, revealing pale, resinous cores that smell faintly of pine and smoke. The rhythm is hypnotic: swing, crack, breath, steam. After a while, you forget what time it is. In those endless winters, Glazer's life became a series of rituals. Chop wood before dawn. Check traps by noon. Melt snow for water. Patch clothing. Feed dogs. Record notes. Repeat. The monotony would drive most people to madness, but for him, it was a kind of meditation. Each repetition carved away the noise until only necessity remained. There's a small radio on the shelf, one of those bulky battery-operated sets that only catches a signal when the wind's just right. Every now and then, he tunes into distant voices. Maybe from Anchorage or Nome, speaking of things that feel unreal: baseball scores, presidential elections, movie stars. He listens for a few minutes, shakes his head, and turns the dial back to static. "They've got no idea," he mutters. You watch him repair a snare line in the dim light of the cabin. His hands move slowly, deliberately, calloused from decades of work. A wolf howls somewhere in the distance, and the dogs lift their heads but don't bark. They know that sound. It's not threat, just conversation. The scholars who later studied Glazer's journals found them surprisingly poetic. In one entry, he wrote, "The wolves sing more honestly than most people speak." You can almost hear him saying it as he leans back in his chair, boots thawing by the fire, a faint grin under the frostbitten mustache. Yet even here, the wilderness doesn't let him forget who's in charge. One morning, he wakes to find his food cache raided, likely by wolverines, those small, furious thieves of the Arctic. He curses softly, shoulders his rifle, and spends the next day rebuilding everything. "They're better engineers than I am," he admits to you with a shrug, and still, he stays. Year after year. It's not bravery anymore. It's habit, fused with something that looks suspiciously like love. There's an evening when the aurora swirls above the cabin, ribbons of green and violet bending and flickering like some cosmic river. The dogs whine, uneasy. Glazer steps outside, his breath curling upward to meet the light. "Every night like this," he says softly, "I remember why I don't leave." You look up too, feeling that same quiet pull, the kind that doesn't shout but hums gently beneath the ribs. Historians still debate whether his solitude dulled his mind or sharpened it. From where you're sitting, watching him sip his crunchy coffee and scribble wolf notes by lamplight, it's clear the answer doesn't matter. He's not escaping anything anymore. He's part of the wilderness, and the wilderness, somehow, is part of him. As the night deepens, you curl up on the floor by the dogs. The fire sputters, the wind howls, and frost paints the windows like lace. You close your eyes and think about how, for Glazer, this isn't hardship, it's home. And for a brief, fleeting moment, you almost envy him. The next winter arrives like a verdict, harder, sharper, without mercy. You've barely grown accustomed to warmth when the winds turn again, slicing down from the mountains. The rivers crust over, the air smells metallic, and even the wolves fall silent. Glazer says, you can tell how bad it'll be by the way the dogs sleep. If they curl tighter, we're in for it. The dogs are little more than fur and breath now, coiled like commas in the snow. Inside, the cabin groans under the pressure of cold. The logs crack audibly, and frost blooms along the window frames in perfect, lacy patterns. You wake one morning to find your boots frozen solid to the floor. Glazer hands you a tin cup of scalding coffee, and for a moment, the steam feels like mercy. It's during this season that Glazer becomes obsessed with silence. He notes how it changes texture depending on temperature. At 40 below, he writes, you can hear your own thoughts scrape. You start to notice it too, the way breath sounds heavier, how footsteps make a brittle crunch instead of a thud. Sound travels differently out here, as if the air itself has thickened with judgment. Sometimes, when the wind dies completely, you can hear the trees shifting, the soft collapse of snow somewhere in the distance. Glazer says it's the forest breathing. You begin to believe him. He still traps, of course, he must, but now his pace slows. He sets fewer lines, checks them less often. Some mornings, he simply walks without destination, following animal tracks until they disappear. You realize he's not hunting anymore. At least not in the old way. He's studying absence, the space where life used to be. A strange detail turns up in his journals from this period. He records his dreams. You read one entry dated February 1935. Dreamed the wolves came to the cabin, he wrote, not for food, but to sleep by the fire. Their paws steamed, their eyes closed. I woke before dawn. Cabin smelled of wet fur. The next line simply says, missed it when I woke. There's tenderness in that note, a kind of longing that scholars rarely mention. But it's there, between the lines. The wilderness wasn't just his subject, it was his companion. By late winter, isolation begins to press in. Glazer talks less. He eats less. The world has narrowed to 3 sounds: wind, breath, and the creak of timber. Days blur together. He measures time now by how much lamp oil is left in the bottle. You try to keep busy, mending nets, sorting tools, cleaning the rifle, but monotony becomes its own predator. Glazer notices and sets you a task, copying maps from his old survey notes. If you don't give the mind something to do, he warns, it'll start chewing on itself. You copy rivers, lakes, and mountains that you've never seen but know by name. Little black lines crawl across the page, tiny symbols of an infinite loneliness. When you look up, you find him watching you with an expression you can't quite read. Maybe pity. Maybe pride. That spring, a letter finally arrives, one of only a handful that ever reached him out here. The envelope is wrinkled, the ink faint from moisture. You hand it to him without asking. He reads it twice, then burns it in the stove without a word. The paper curls and blackens, sending up a wisp of blue smoke that smells faintly sweet. You don't ask what it said. You don't need to. His hands tremble when he pours another cup of coffee, and that's answer enough. As the thaw returns, Glazer falls ill for the first time you've seen. Nothing dramatic, just a cough that won't leave, a weariness in his bones. Too many winters, he mutters. But there's no doctor within 200 miles, no medicine but whiskey and rest. You do what you can, keep the fire high, fetch water, patch leaks. The days drag by, heavy with the scent of damp wool and smoke. He recovers slowly, though thinner than before. His beard is streaked with white now. Still, he insists on walking the ridge as soon as he's strong enough. You go with him, step for step, through melting snow and muddy thaw. The sun is weak but steady. He pauses often, leaning on his rifle, looking down at the valley below. The wolves are out again, sleek and restless. Glazer smiles faintly. They made it, he says. It's hard to tell whether he means them or himself. That night, back in the cabin, he opens an old trunk you've never seen him touch. Inside, notebooks bound with string, faded maps, a few sepia photographs. He shows you one, a younger version of himself standing beside a seaplane, grinning like a man about to fall off the edge of the world. We thought Alaska was empty, he says. Turns out it was just waiting. He sets the photo aside and begins sorting his notes, muttering dates under his breath. If the university ever sends someone for these, don't let them ruin it with theories, he says. This isn't about proving things. It's about remembering. Outside, the wind shifts. You can hear the first frogs croaking near the half-thawed creek. Life returning, soft and slow. Glazer doesn't write that night. Instead, he sits with his boots off, staring into the fire until it burns low. You realize, then, that you're witnessing something few ever get to see, the fading of a man who belonged nowhere else. When you step outside for air, the sky is pulsing with northern lights, green and violet ribbons swaying across the black. You imagine them as the wilderness breathing, whispering thanks to the man who listened longest. Inside, Glazer's voice drifts through the doorway, low, gravelly, and oddly peaceful. Tomorrow, he says, we'll go farther. You don't know if he means down the ridge or somewhere beyond all this. But you nod anyway, letting the cold air bite your face, the aurora hum above you like the echo of a prayer you never learned to say. The thaw comes with noisef, melting ice cracking like gunfire, rivers roaring awake, and ravens gossiping in black swarms over the treetops. After months of stillness, the wilderness feels alive again, almost too alive. You can smell mud, wet bark, thawing carcasses, all tangled into a scent that says the world is rebuilding itself. Glazer's cabin, once the center of his quiet dominion, now feels like a station on a larger map. People start showing up again, not many, but enough to remind you that civilization hasn't entirely forgotten this place. The first visitor arrives by plane. The noise is jarring, a mechanical snarl that shatters the peace. A bush pilot named Ray drags himself out of the cockpit, squinting through the glare. He's got mail, whiskey, and gossip. He's heard about the old wolf man and wanted to see if the legend had teeth. Glazer doesn't correct him. He just nods, pours coffee, and lets Ray talk. The pilot tells stories of prospectors gone missing, of trappers eaten by their own sled dogs, of scientists claiming they'd found gold under the permafrost. You get the sense half of it's nonsense, but Glazer listens anyway, like a man tuning into a distant frequency. When Ray finally leaves, Glazer mutters, they think they're discovering Alaska. Alaska is just waiting for them to leave. Weeks later, another stranger appears, a naturalist with the curious gleam of academia in his eyes. He's heard whispers about Glazer's wolf journals. He wants to see them. Glazer's polite but wary. They're not finished, he says, which you know is code for you wouldn't understand them yet. The man persists. He asks about diet, pack hierarchy, den rotation, even scat composition. Glazer answers in clipped sentences. Finally, he says, you ever lived through a winter out here? The naturalist admits no. Glazer shrugs. Then you've only studied half the truth. Historians still argue whether that visitor was a young Adolph Murray, the famed wildlife biologist who later revolutionized wolf research in Denali. The timelines overlap, but the evidence is thin. Some scholars insist Glazer's early observations shaped Murray's work, others say it's coincidence. You suspect the truth lies somewhere between, a quiet influence, uncredited but undeniable. After the naturalist departs, Glazer seems restless. He starts cleaning tools, patching gear, as if preparing for something unnamed. Every spring, he says, the wilderness tests you again. You either move or get swallowed. You move with him. Together, you travel farther north than before, beyond the spruce line, where the tundra rolls like an ocean of moss and frozen puddles. The mosquitoes are biblical in number. You wave them away in vain, they land on your eyelashes, crawl into your collar, hum like tiny chainsaws. Glazer laughs at your misery. They keep the amateurs out, he says. In the evenings, you camp under skies that never quite go dark. The midnight sun hovers low, painting everything gold and ghostly. Glazer tells stories, not the ones from the papers or the radio, but older ones. He speaks of prospectors who found gold and vanished, of a trapper who swore he'd seen mammoth bones poking from a thawed riverbank, of a wolf that walked with a limp and seemed to live forever. You realize he's cataloging Alaska not through data, but through memory. His knowledge isn't written in equations, it's carved in weather, silence, and the rhythm of the land. One evening, as you cook over a small fire, a second visitor appears, gaunt, sunburned, eyes wide with relief. A prospector, half mad from hunger and isolation. "Saw your smoke," he says, trembling. "Thought I was done for." Glazer gives him food, dry clothes, and coffee so strong it could wake the dead. The man eats like a starving bear, then weeps without warning. When he finally speaks, he admits he lost his partner in a storm weeks back. Buried him under ice. Didn't even mark the spot right, he says, voice cracking. Glazer listens in silence, then quietly offers him a blanket. "You don't have to remember the exact place," he says. "The mountain does." You lie awake that night, staring at the dim glow on the horizon, and realize you've just witnessed Glazer's other job, the caretaker of lost souls. He doesn't advertise it, but word must travel somehow. People appear, broken, desperate, and he helps them find their footing again. By midsummer, he's hosting a rotating cast of visitors, pilots trading coffee for stories, government men seeking weather data, hunters pretending to ask about moose but really craving human company. Even a missionary passes through, offering him a Bible. Glazer takes it politely, then uses it later to level a wobbly table. "Good book," he says, "terrible carpenter." It's not that he hates people, he just finds them temporary. They arrive, make noise, and vanish. The wolves, by contrast, are constants. You start noticing them again, closer now, unafraid. Sometimes, at dusk, Glazer walks out with scraps of meat and leaves them on the ridge. "Not feeding," he says. "Paying rent." One night, the prospector, still recovering, asks him, "Aren't you ever scared?" Glazer pokes the fire, sparks rising into the dusk. Of what? The dark? The silence? Or the truth that they're not the dangerous ones? The man doesn't ask again. Later, when the mosquitoes fade and the air grows crisp again, the prospector leaves, following the river south. Glazer stands on the bank watching him go, then says softly, "They always do." As you walk back to the cabin, the wolves are waiting. A few linger at a distance, eyes gleaming like embers. They don't move. Glazer nods at them, a small acknowledgement. You swear one nods back. Inside, as he lights the lantern, he says, "Some people bring civilization wherever they go. Me? I prefer to visit theirs once in a while." He sits down, opens his notebook, and begins to write, his pen scratching faintly over paper while the wolves sing to the stars, and you realize, the world keeps coming to find him, but he never really leaves the wilderness. It's the only home that ever wanted him back. The air thins as autumn deepens. The mosquitoes vanish, replaced by long sighs of wind that bend the grasses flat. The tundra blushes red and orange beneath the slanted sun, and the world feels both dying and alive. You and Glazer are miles from the cabin now, camped near a ridge where the land opens into a sweeping plain, a stage where wolves perform their oldest dramas. He calls it the Wolves' Winter Ballad. The phrase sounds poetic, but when you see it, you understand why he chose it. The scene unfolds like choreography, one pack shadowing another, howls ricocheting through the valleys, invisible until suddenly, the whole drama explodes into motion. Gray bodies streaking through gold grass, a rush of muscle and snow, you watch from a distance, breath caught in your throat. Glazer, crouched beside you, whispers, "See that one leading? The old female. She's run this stretch for 3 winters. Smartest animal I've met." The wolves close in on a caribou, then veer off at the last second, regrouping, testing. It's not chaos. It's conversation. Glazer scribbles notes in his pocket journal, eyes bright. They're teaching the pups to flank, he murmurs. That's not instinct, it's education. You realize this is what keeps him alive, not solitude, but witnessing. He's not hiding from the world, he's documenting it before it disappears. Later, back at camp, you cook thin stew and listen to the wolves' howls echo through the night. It's not frightening anymore. It's musical, layered, almost choral. The sky burns with northern lights again, ribbons of green and violet twisting across the dark like some celestial pulse. Glazer hums under his breath, matching the cadence of the howls. Every pack's got a song, he says. And every winter, they add a new verse. Historians still argue whether his longhand wolf journals, thousands of pages now yellowed with age, constitute the first genuine ethnography of wild animals. Some claim his observations anticipated later behavioral science by decades. Others dismiss it as anecdotal rambling from a hermit. The debate endures because the journals themselves are fragmentary, written in shorthand, sometimes in pencil that faded with damp. You imagine scholars squinting over lines like they mourned the lost one for 2 days, unsure whether he meant an animal or himself. That night, the temperature drops fast. The world contracts into a cocoon of breath and frost. You wake to the sound of movement near camp, low, deliberate, close. You reach for the rifle, but Glazer shakes his head. Don't, he whispers. A wolf steps into the firelight. Large, silver-gray. Eyes like wet stone. It stands 10 paces away, unmoving. Behind it, you sense more shapes in the dark, 3, maybe 4 others. Glazer speaks softly, voice steady. That's her. The matriarch. He doesn't move closer. Doesn't feed her. Just watches. The wolf tilts her head, assessing, then snorts a faint puff of steam and melts back into the dark. The rest follow, silent as smoke. Glazer exhales. She wanted to see if we'd forgotten the rules. You ask what rules, but he doesn't answer. Instead, he pokes at the fire and mutters, we share this world, not own it. Forget that, and they remind you. The next day, you trek farther into the valley to find the wolves' den. It takes hours of scanning. Reading faint trails and scattered prints. Finally, you find it, a hollow dug into the slope, surrounded by bones, fur, and faint tracks of pups. Glazer doesn't go near it. He kneels from a distance, removes his hat, and stays silent for a long time. He jots something afterward. Respect is measured in how close you choose not to go. The phrase lingers with you. You realize the man's not just observing nature, he's writing an ethics manual for it. That evening, clouds roll in, heavy and dark. The aurora vanishes behind them, replaced by snow that falls slow and thick, muting the world. You sit in the dim tent, lamp flickering, while Glazer sharpens a knife that doesn't need sharpening. The sound is soothing, rhythmic. He talks, almost absently. When I started, I thought wolves were villains. Then I thought they were saints. Turns out they're just not alive. Trying to make sense of hunger and fear, same as us. He pauses, the blade gleaming in lamplight. Maybe that's why I stayed out here. I fit better with creatures that don't lie to themselves. You smile faintly. So you're saying you're a wolf now? He chuckles, a low, dry sound. Nah. I'm more like an old moose that forgot the herd. When the storm passes, you step outside into a world remade. Snow covers everything. Soft and unbroken. The wolves' tracks crisscross the plain, a calligraphy of survival. You follow one set for a while, careful not to disturb it, until the prints fade into wind-blown drifts. For the first time, you understand what he means when he calls the wilderness a living map. It's not about territory, it's about memory. Every footprint, every broken branch is a story that vanishes if no one's there to read it. Back at camp, Glazer is sketching by lanternlight, rough outlines of wolves mid-run. His fingers tremble a bit from cold, but the lines are sure. Someday they'll pave this place, he says quietly. Airports, pipelines, tourists with cameras. And they'll still call it wild. You look out over the frozen valley, listening to distant howls rise and fall like tides. The sound carries a melancholy too vast to name. Glazer closes his notebook, rubs his hands by the fire, and murmurs, "Good concert tonight." You nod, too drowsy to reply. The snow keeps falling, thick and silent, tucking the world in under a blanket of white. Somewhere in the dark, the wolves finish their song, and you drift into sleep, unsure where their rhythm ends and your heartbeat begins. Winter returns like a slow, inevitable drumbeat. The tundra hardens under frost, rivers freeze into glassy ribbons, and every breath hangs like a cloud you could catch in your hands. You've come to expect it, yet the first cold snap still takes your bones by surprise. Glazer moves through it like a man who belongs to the season, his boots crunching across hardened snow, scarf pulled tight, eyes scanning the horizon. He talks little these days, letting the dog set the pace. You notice small rituals. He checks the sled runners twice, pats the musher's gloves, leaves a tiny pile of oats near the fire for squirrels. He's in dialogue with everything around him, the wind, the sky, even the silence itself. This winter is harsher than most. A blizzard sweeps in one morning, erasing the trail behind you in minutes. Visibility drops to nothing, the world contracts to the size of your sled and the breathing of your dogs. You cling to the runners, muscles trembling, as Glazer steers by instinct, eyes half closed against the wind, muttering to the pack. Historians still argue whether he ever truly mastered these storms or if he just survived them by stubbornness and luck. Whatever the case, watching him now, you sense it's a mix of both, practical skill intertwined with an almost mystical attunement to the land. During a brief lull, you both huddle in a shallow depression, waiting out the worst of the wind. Glazer pours coffee into tin cups. The steam curling like smoke signals. Some people call it madness, he says, his voice nearly drowned by the whistling air. I call it education. The dogs whine softly. Wolves howl somewhere beyond the ridge, distant but persistent, a reminder that other beings claim this territory too. The sound carries over ice and snow, eerie and familiar. Glazer smiles faintly. They check in, he says. Not friends. Not enemies. Just neighbors. Later, when the storm passes, you emerge to a world transformed. Snowdrifts tower like small hills, frozen trees glitter like crystal sculptures. You follow tracks, wolf, caribou, your own, through the aftermath. Each print tells a story, and Glazer reads them as if narrating a novel in real time. Here, she hunted. Here, the young ones played. Here, the wind buried it all. You notice something new, a faint smell of smoke on the wind. Someone's cabin, miles away, has lit a fire. The scent carries with it the human world, faint and distant, almost intrusive. Glazer sniffs, then shrugs. They'll be gone before we even reach them, he predicts. And he's right, the smell fades as you trudge on. At camp that night, Glazer brings out old photographs, yellowed and curling. Some are of the wolves he's known, others of early airplanes clattering across the tundra. One is of a mining camp, frozen in time, the men frozen in smiles they would never remember. He doesn't explain them, he simply lays them out, letting the images speak. You recognize a pattern. Every photo, every sketch, every note is a record of passage, a map of absence and presence intertwined. You ask about the wolves in the photos. Each one has a story, he says softly. Just like us. Some get remembered. Most don't. Quirky details emerge in his talk. He once measured the average howl of wolves at -20 degrees and charted how the sound carried over ice and stone. Some nights, he'd mimic a howl to see if a distant pack would respond. He chuckled, calling it the world's coldest conversation. You laugh quietly, imagining him crouched in snow, lips trembling, trying to talk to wolves over a mile of frozen emptiness. As midnight approaches, the aurora begins its slow pulse again. Green and purple threads of light weave across the sky. Glazer leans back on his elbows, gazing upward. "I've seen these lights almost every night for decades," he says. "Still takes my breath away." You feel the same, despite knowing the routine. There's a wonder in repetition when the repetition itself is beautiful. The northern lights flicker, the wolves answer with distant howls, and the two of you sit in quiet harmony, tethered not to civilization but to the rhythm of survival. Historians still debate whether Glazer's obsession with isolation was self-imposed or inevitable given the land's vastness. Perhaps it doesn't matter. Watching him now, seeing the precision of his movements, the attentiveness to sound and scent, you understand that his solitude was not punishment but apprenticeship, a lifetime study of life at its rawest. By the fire's dim glow, he closes his notebook and mutters, "Winter teaches patience. And patience teaches humility." You nod, feeling the truth of it settle into your chest. Outside, the wind moans softly through the trees, a lullaby only the wilderness could compose. Spring arrives cautiously, as if the land itself isn't sure it remembers how. Snow melts in reluctant sheets, leaving behind mud that sucks at your boots and rivers that run with a metallic tang. You watch the first green shoots push up from the frozen earth, fragile yet insistent, and realize that life doesn't wait, it just persists. Glazer notices too, but he doesn't comment. He just adjusts his pack and moves on, as though acknowledging that nothing is permanent, not even thaw. The thaw changes everything. Wolves return to their hunting grounds, caribou begin to migrate again, and the rivers swell with meltwater. Rough and fast. Glazer uses these months to travel farther afield, mapping the tundra, recording pack movements, even noting bird migrations. "Everything counts," he mutters one afternoon while bending to inspect a broken twig. "Everything leaves a footprint." Historians still argue whether Glazer's records were meant for posterity or simply for his own survival. There's evidence both ways. Some notebooks read like meticulous field studies, others like personal journals filled with sketches, half-legible annotations, and musings on solitude. You start to see the pattern. He documents life not for fame, not for science, but to remember it when the snow buries it all. A quirky detail surfaces during a long trek along the riverbank. Glazer collects bits of ice shaped like animal tracks and arranges them on a flat rock, noting which ones might have been overlooked by predators. "The universe doesn't always notice the small things," he says. You nod, realizing the lesson isn't about ice, it's about paying attention. Days pass in a blur of walking, mapping, and observing. At night, the campfire glows faintly, smoke curling into the still air. Wolves howling somewhere distant punctuate the silence, a reminder that you're sharing space with creatures older than any human settlement. Occasionally, one approaches the perimeter of camp, pausing to observe before melting back into shadow. Glazer never feeds them, the gesture is purely observational, respectful, a silent agreement between species. During one morning walk, you come across a partially thawed caribou carcass. The wolves have begun their work already, picking at what the snow preserved. Glazer kneels to observe without interference. "This is how the circle works," he whispers. "No favorites. No cruelty, just balance." You feel a strange reverence. Survival isn't glamorous, it isn't heroic. It is methodical, precise, sometimes brutal, and always demanding attention. You realize that Glazer's decades of isolation didn't numb him. They sharpened him. Every decision, every observation, is infused with a deep awareness of consequence. He shares another quirky note from his journals. He once catalogued snow patterns left by foxes after storms, noting the way the sun's angle distorted their tracks. Little geometry lessons, he called them. You imagine him bent over fresh snow, studying tiny impressions with a magnifying glass, smiling quietly at the hidden order of the world. By evening, the temperature has risen just enough to feel like promise. You and Glazer sit by a creek, listening to water rush over rocks, the northern light dimming into a soft twilight. The dogs doze, the wolves' howls echo faintly from distant ridges, and the air hums with the sound of life reborn. Glazer breaks the silence. Spring reminds you that winter is temporary, and that everything that survives carries memory forward. You nod, considering not just the land and animals, but the lessons etched into every frozen footprint and melted trail. That night, you lie awake listening to the chorus of the wilderness, water, wind, and distant wolves. For the first time, it doesn't feel alien, it feels like a conversation you might just be able to join. If only you keep paying attention, summer unfolds in a long, golden haze that stretches the day into nearly endless hours. You wake before dawn, the sky faintly lit with an orange-pink glow, and the world feels simultaneously vast and intimate. The tundra hums with life, insects buzzing, birds calling from hidden nests, and the distant drum of caribou hooves. Glazer moves like a shadow beside you, scanning the horizon for tracks, changes, anything that might signal movement in the wild. This is the season of observation and subtle rituals. He wakes early, always, tending to the dogs first, checking traps, making notes on the melting snowpack, and occasionally jotting sketches of plants or animal tracks. He has a rhythm to it, a cadence that feels almost sacred. You follow him silently, realizing that in decades of solitude, he's built a world of structure in a place where nothing stays the same for long. One morning, you spot a herd of caribou moving across the valley. The light catches their fur like spun gold. Glazer doesn't point. Instead, he steps carefully, crouches behind a small rise, and observes. He whispers to you, every herd has a rhythm. You can predict it if you watch long enough. You follow his gaze, trying to see the world as he does, subtle movements, tiny hesitations, the weight of instinct. Historians still debate whether Glazer's observations influenced later wildlife management practices in Alaska, particularly the study of predator-prey balance. Some claim his notes provided foundational insights, while others argue they were personal musings, unstructured and anecdotal. You don't need an academic verdict to understand their value, witnessing him in motion is enough. A quirky habit emerges during these long days. Glazer collects oddly shaped stones and arranges them near the cabin. Some are triangular, others rounded with perfect holes, like tiny natural sculptures. Art, he says lightly, from a place that doesn't need it. You realize he's finding beauty in the mundane, preserving traces of the land that humans rarely notice. The wolves remain near the edges of your journeys. Sometimes they watch silently, sometimes a lone scout appears at night, crouched at the tree line, observing before vanishing. Glazer treats them as neighbors, never intruding, never provoking. One evening, a young wolf pup appears alone at the edge of camp, curious and cautious. Glazer tosses a scrap of meat without a word. The pup sniffs, takes it, and disappears. Small interactions like these seem trivial but are charged with lessons in trust and patience. During a particularly sweltering afternoon, the two of you rest by a creek. Glazer fishes for grayling with a simple rod, his hands precise and unhurried. He talks softly about past summers, about winters that tested him, about letters he never sent. His voice is low, almost musical, blending with the creek's gurgle. People think isolation is empty, he says, but it's full of conversations you'll never hear anywhere else. Quirky details from his journals reveal the depths of his engagement. He measured how the angle of the sun affected the growth of moss near different water sources, noting how microecosystems shifted over the decades. He joked about being a botanist/wolf whisperer, and you can imagine him bent over a patch of moss, squinting through a magnifying glass, muttering observations that sound absurdly precise to anyone else. Night brings its own wonder. The sun barely dips below the horizon, casting a soft, golden light across the cabin and river. The wolves sing from the ridges, a faint chorus, sometimes joined by distant caribou calls. Glazer sits outside, sketching, writing, humming faintly. You realize that summer is both a test and a reward. The land blooms, the animals move, and every day is a lesson in attention, endurance, and quiet joy. By the time you collapse into your sleeping bag, the warmth of the day fading into the lingering glow of twilight, you understand why he stayed. The wilderness offers not just survival, but a conversation older than memory itself. By late summer, the days begin to shrink imperceptibly, and a crispness returns to the mornings that hints at winter's approach. You feel it in your bones. The air carries a different weight, heavier and colder, like a promise you cannot ignore. Glazer notices it too, although he doesn't comment much. Instead, he focuses on practical matters, securing food stores, repairing the cabin, checking traps, and teaching you to read the subtle signs of the land. The wolves are more visible now, following distant trails, moving with purpose as if aware that the seasonal rhythm is shifting. Glazer notes their behavior meticulously, the way a mother nudges her pup, how the pack positions itself against wind, how they communicate without sound. You start noticing details you'd have ignored before, the lift of a tail, the angle of a head, the tiniest paw prints in soft soil. Historians still argue whether Glazer's wolf observations were the earliest form of modern behavioral ecology, predating many published studies. Some dismiss him as an eccentric recluse, but the accuracy of his notes suggests careful and repeated observation over decades. You realize the wilderness was his laboratory, the wolves his research partners, and silence his medium of study. A quirky detail arises one day when you stumble upon a small patch of wildflowers bent and frozen in the shallow frost. Glazer bends to inspect them, noting each species and its resilience. He sketches them in the notebook, muttering, "Even the smallest life resists the end." You're struck by his ability to notice what most would pass by. And it reminds you of his other obsessive practices, measuring snowflakes, counting bird calls, cataloging wind direction, all small acts of devotion. Occasionally, visitors still arrive, usually pilots or researchers, though fewer than before. One day, a young journalist appears, notebook in hand, eager to tell Glazer's story. He listens politely, answers questions briefly, and then stops, looking directly at you. "If you write it wrong," he says, "you'll miss the point entirely." That evening, Glazer takes you on a long walk to a ridge overlooking a valley he calls the Cathedral of Quiet. The light is soft, filtered through drifting clouds. Wolves move in the distance, caribou graze. And the wind carries distant scents of spruce and melting ice. He points to a spot where he once found an abandoned prospector's camp, long overgrown. "Nothing lasts untouched," he says. "Even our footprints disappear." You begin to understand his obsession with recording everything: maps, notes, sketches, journals, all attempts to capture what the wilderness refuses to forget but cannot keep in place. He believes that survival isn't just physical, it's remembering, noting, witnessing. A quirky observation he shares this evening: he's been tracking the songs of ravens, noting slight regional differences, and has concluded they might have dialects. You laugh softly, imagining him lying in snow to listen to bird calls, pencil poised, taking notes with the seriousness of a field scientist and the obsession of a man who's seen decades pass in silence. By nightfall, the sun dips low, and the air grows sharply cold. You settle near the fire, listening to distant wolves and the rustle of leaves in dying shrubs. Glazer doesn't speak much, he's focused on tracing lines in his notebook, connecting events, patterns, and observations. When you finally lie down to sleep, you feel the weight of history pressing gently on you. Not the human kind, but the wilderness's own long memory, preserved in tracks, scat, and the living breath of creatures that have survived here far longer than any man could hope to. Autumn deepens, and the tundra begins its slow retreat into silence. Leaves turn to gold and russet before curling into brittle brown, and the first frost creeps over the grasses at night. Glazer moves efficiently, preparing for the long winter ahead. Food caches are restocked, tools repaired, and the cabin fortified against the inevitable snow. You notice that his pace is slower, deliberate, as if every movement is measured against decades of experience. The wolves are less visible now, though their presence is felt everywhere, the ghostly echoes of howls. The occasional paw prints crossing frozen streams, and the distant flash of eyes reflecting the dim light. Glazer keeps meticulous notes, documenting movements, behavior, and patterns. "They're preparing too," he says. "Everything out here anticipates winter." Historians still debate the accuracy of Glazer's observations. Some claim his records were anecdotal, colored by isolation and personal interpretation. Others argue they represent one of the most detailed longitudinal studies of wolf behavior in North America. Either way, the depth of his understanding is undeniable. You realize that he doesn't simply observe, he empathizes, translating the rhythms of the wilderness into human comprehension. One quirky habit emerges during this season. Glazer marks the winter's approach by listening to the creaking of frozen trees at night. Each snap, groan, and crack is catalogued in his mind. "Trees talk," he says. "You just have to listen long enough to understand their language." You laugh quietly, but you also find yourself pausing. Noticing how the world communicates in subtle, often overlooked ways. One afternoon, while walking along a ridge, you spot a lone wolf trailing the edge of the valley. Its coat is a patchwork of gray and white, fur-dusted with early frost. Glazer crouches beside you, not making a sound. You watch as the wolf pauses, sniffs the air, then disappears into the brush. He whispers, "She remembers us." You realize that decades of coexistence have forged a quiet truce, a mutual acknowledgement between man and wild. By mid-October, snow begins to fall sporadically, dusting the ground, frosting the windows of the cabin. Glazer starts preparing the sled and harnessing the dogs for regular winter runs. The northern lights flare more frequently now, painting the sky in waves of green and violet, shimmering across the icy terrain. The effect is hypnotic, a reminder of the vastness of the land and the insignificance of human concerns. He also revisits old letters during these days, carefully cataloging and storing them in tins. You notice a mix of correspondence, letters never sent, letters received long after they were relevant, some of them yellowed, brittle, and curling at the edges. He handles each with reverence, as if the paper itself carries the memory of the human world. One evening, he takes out a photograph of himself as a young man, standing beside a frozen river, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "I thought I was conquering the wilderness," he murmurs. "Turns out I was just learning to listen." You understand instantly, his survival wasn't measured by skill or strength, but by attention, patience, and humility. As the days shorten, the wind grows colder, carrying hints of snowstorms to come. Glazer tightens his scarf, checks the firewood supply, and writes a final entry in his notebook for the day. He looks up at the horizon, where the sun clings low in the sky, and simply says, "Winter always returns, and we must be ready to meet it." You realize that in all this, Glazer has not merely survived, he has become part of the wilderness's long story, a chapter written in footprints, howl, frost, and observation. And you, watching him, are now part of that chapter too. The first heavy snow arrives, silent and relentless, blanketing the cabin, ridge, and valley in a uniform white. The wind howls through the spruce like a choir of invisible voices, rattling shutters and carrying the scent of frostbite and frozen earth. You pull your coat tighter, feel the bite of cold on exposed skin, and realize that the world has contracted to the size of your small cabin and the breathing of your dogs. Glazer moves with deliberate precision, harnessing the dogs, checking supplies, and preparing for weeks of travel over frozen trails. The sled glides across the ice-crusted snow with ease, the runners cutting through the silence. You follow, muscles aching, breath clouding the air in small bursts. The landscape is mesmerizing and terrifying, every hill and valley both familiar and alien under the snow's weight. He delivers mail on a schedule known only to himself and a few scattered pilots. Sometimes it's letters, other times, food, medical supplies, or a long-forgotten parcel from a prospector who has since vanished. He navigates by intuition, by memory, by observation. You marvel at his ability to read the subtle cues of the land, a shift in wind, the color of snow, the angle of frozen river ice. Historians still argue whether Glazer's routes were mapped with precision or mere survival instinct. Some insist he memorized every contour of the land, others suggest he simply allowed the wilderness to guide him, trusting his own senses above all else. Watching him now, you think it's both, knowledge honed by experience, intuition refined over decades. The wolves, now almost invisible against the snow, follow at a distance. Sometimes their eyes catch the lantern light from the cabin, brief glimmers in the dark. Glazer treats them with the same quiet respect he has for years, no interference, no feeding, just acknowledgement. One night, a matriarch steps close enough for you to see her amber eyes, then melts back into the white landscape. You realize that she is part sentinel, part companion, a silent witness to this man's extraordinary endurance. Inside the cabin, Glazer tends the fire, repairs gear, and catalogs mail. He shares quiet stories of winters past, sled dogs lost to storms, abandoned camps, and the subtle humor of mistakes that nearly became disasters. He jokes lightly about surviving on reindeer beans or measuring frostbite by the number of toes lost. 3 laughs per winter, he claims. You laugh with him, even as your teeth chatter from the cold. As the weeks pass, the outside world shrinks to trails, snowdrifts, and the faint echoes of distant avalanches. You realize survival is no longer a struggle but a conversation with the land. Every gesture, throwing firewood on the stove, mending a torn coat, observing wolf behavior, is part of a dialogue that has continued for decades. Late one night, you watch Glazer scribble in his notebook by lantern light. He pauses, lifts his eyes to the falling snow, and whispers, "Time is different here. Days last a lifetime, and lifetimes last a day." You sense the truth in his words. The wilderness is both teacher and companion, demanding attention, patience, and respect. By the end of the season, you've learned more than you ever thought possible, about patience, observation, and the quiet endurance required to survive alone. Glazer's life is not just a story of survival, it is an anthology of adaptation, humility, and coexistence. He has not merely endured, he has thrived, leaving traces of memory and insight for those willing to witness. Outside, the wolves' howls rise over the white expanse, distant and haunting, a lullaby for the wilderness itself. You realize the world is vast, indifferent, yet alive, and that Glazer has become part of its enduring rhythm, a solitary but essential note in its long, unbroken song. The snow continues to fall softly, muting the edges of the world. You lie in the cabin, wrapped in blankets, listening to the faint whistle of wind through the spruce, the occasional rattle of ice against the roof, and the distant, haunting chorus of wolves. It's a sound that once might have been frightening, but now feels like a gentle reminder of rhythm and continuity. You realize that survival isn't measured in hours or meals. It's measured in attention, in noticing, in quietly being present. Outside, the northern lights shimmer faintly, threads of green and violet weaving through the inky sky. The colors feel alive, almost breathing, pulsing in time with your own heartbeat. You let your eyes follow the undulating waves, feeling the tension of the day melt away, replaced by a calm awareness that the world continues beyond human reckoning. Glazer sleeps nearby, a quiet figure of endurance and patience. Decades of solitude have honed him into a master of observation and resilience, yet he moves through the wilderness with humility, never assuming dominion, never claiming ownership. You see the wisdom in his restraint, the profound peace that comes from coexisting with the world rather than conquering it. Even the smallest things seem meaningful now, the soft crunch of snow underfoot, the rhythmic sigh of the wind, the warmth of a campfire, and the distant call of an unseen wolf. Each detail is a thread in a larger tapestry, a reminder that life persists in cycles, that memory and experience are carried forward quietly, often without acknowledgement. You let your thoughts drift, carried by the soft hum of the wilderness. Imagine decades of quiet observation, of winters endured and summers watched, of friendships with creatures who teach without speaking. Glazer's life is both extraordinary and simple, an ongoing conversation with the land, a testament to patience, and a guide for those willing to notice. As your eyelids grow heavy, you feel a comforting rhythm settle over you, syncing with the quiet pulse of the wilderness. Every exhale is a lullaby, every heartbeat a gentle echo of the world beyond the cabin walls. The wolves' distant howls, the shifting snow, the flicker of northern lights, all merge into a slow, soothing cadence that carries you towards sleep, and so, you drift, suspended between awareness and dreams. Wrapped in the calm, enduring embrace of a world that continues to move, breathe, and survive, just as Glazer did for over 40 years alone.